Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Back to the Workplace with Connected Technology. A few housekeeping rules. The webinar is 45 minutes. We'll have 30 minutes of dynamic debate. Questions that you ask during the session we'll attempt to get to in the Q&A. Judging by previous webinars, we won't get to all of them, so we're going to adopt two approaches. One is which is to follow up with you and answer any questions, and the second is to feed them into the next session of webinars, which will touch on solutions and benefits, return on investment from some of the technologies, and being ready for the new workplace. This webinar is recorded, so those that attend will get an email with a link to the recording and a link to the integrations that we're referring to in the webinar. Let's just touch on the structure. So I'm going to introduce the panel today. We'll have the panel discussion for 30 minutes and then go straight into the Q&A. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Simon Cohen.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Simon is Partner Director of Condeca UK, has led the technology integration strategy there, and so I'm glad to have him on the panel today. Next is Simone Fenton Jarvis from Ricoh.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Simone. And Simone basically runs the consultancy side of Ricoh, looking at some of the challenges people face today, and therefore has been heavily engaged in them in the last 3 or 4 months. Next, Sam Farrant. Welcome, Sam.
Good afternoon, everyone.
So Sam is Managing Director of VPod, one of the technology solutions that is particularly handy, useful in the reception area, and as a result, he's had to deal firsthand with a lot of the challenges that customers are asking him to deal with in the reception area, and not just the desk and workplace area. So we thought excellent addition to the panel and welcome him on board. Last but not least, Annie Hood, Chief Executive of Well Intelligence. Annie brings with us a host of what I would call the more worrying side, or the more sensitive side, which is how do you deal with the people aspects and how does an organization deal with it? So both spheres, and looking forward to hearing her input on the challenges in the workplace today. So we're going to cover the getting back to the workplace. We're going to cover specifically 2 aspects of it, because I think it's important to mention that it's fine being ready to go back to the workplace pre-vaccine or vaccination for COVID, but it's also having the workplace ready to go back to, from a point of the workplace has undoubtedly changed with the adoption of, for lots of us, remote working technologies. So in the planning session, we're going to start basically with Simone and Annie in terms of organizations planning to bring back people back to the workplace. What are the considerations you've seen, Annie first, that they've been looking at, challenged by, and have considered?
Thank you, Simon. Well, 3 key things really from me. The first is communication. And clearly there are things that you have to be compliant to, but more than anything, building trust, transparency, the removal of unwanted surprises for employees is really mission critical. And when I say communication, I don't just mean sending a memo. I mean a real conversation with your employees, understanding how they feel, what their anxieties might be, or it might be they might have a devil may care attitude to coming back to the office space, but understanding, you know, really where they are in that sort of pendulum swing between perhaps bewilderment and acceptance for where we are. The second is the interdependency that can't be ignored. We're going to be talking a lot about technology as a necessity over a choice, but that isn't your one-dimensional silver bullet. Safety and protection, of course. Trust, responsibility of the employer and the employee. I know we're going to come on to that a little later. And the employee perspective, that understanding where people are. And the third is culture and leadership, the language and the narrative and how we as leaders manage the return from an empathic and compassionate perspective.
Simone, over to you next. How have you seen companies tackling that whole communication to the employee, or what elements are they considering when they look at dealing with employees coming back to the workplace?
I guess interestingly, there's been a massive difference between people that are very much spreadsheets, almost back of a fag packet approach, to the ones that are looking at the more kind of strategic, what does this mean for in the future? I think, you know, like Annie said, it has to be led by that people. You know, we can prepare the workplace for people to go back into it, but we need to make sure that we're preparing the people to go back into the workplace. You know, and ultimately you can make a workplace safe, but the second people get in there, you know, how do we make them feel safe once they're in there? And I think that goes back to that communication, and just listening to your people.
And I think that's important. So back to you, Annie, for a second. On being able to actually demonstrate that the workplace is safe now and communicate that, have you seen different companies tackling that challenge?
You know, there are differences in approach. You know, some are being a lot more sensitive in the vein I described, of narrowing the gap, if you will, between those conversations between the employer and the employee. And I'd call that a sort of personability, being on the front foot with employee conversations. And that sort of tribal community feel, you know, there's that value of community that people are desperate to participate in again, and a tighter sense of camaraderie that I think is coming through fostering trust. And I will just say, for those companies, anyone listening who hasn't turbocharged, if you will, their conversations and communication with their employee, it's not too late, but you've got to do it. Because you know, the more gap there is between people not knowing what's going on, the more fear, you know, you're actually feeding, and you want to take that away. That's going to be the biggest thing for people. So some companies are doing very well and are telling me that they've never had closer relationships with their employees, and it's a real positive. And others are a little more head in the sand, or devil may care is perhaps a nicer way of putting it. But you know, they're taking they're not taking the steps that I think are needed, and that may bite them a little later.
And that's a good point. So one of the keys here is the price of getting it wrong. All right, and the risks of getting it wrong, not just the legal ones, because you can get enforcement orders placed on you, but the fear of getting it wrong if you're an employee or you head up the legal department in an organization. So this is what the webinar will touch on in more detail. Simone, in terms of that fear aspect and good and bad, what you've seen in the workplace today, how people have addressed that fear well or not, as the case may be. Could you give us an insight into what you've seen?
Yeah, again, it's very mixed. There's people that are looking to just brush the fear under the carpet and hope for the best, and very much kind of going with the approach of, oh, it won't happen to us. People just kind of need to just kind of move on, and you know, comparing it to the flu and just saying this is not a big issue. And that kind of, you know, telling somebody that their feelings are irrelevant isn't helping them to, you know, kind of make sense of their feelings. And also, you know, this is a time for compassion and empathy and that human touch. You know, it's like someone saying to me, don't be scared of spiders. I'm still going to be scared of spiders. It's just one of them things. So I think, you know, the people that are doing it well and doing it good are listening. And there's a massive difference between, you know, taking someone's opinion on board and going and bringing them back into the workplace if that is needed at their own pace, looking at on an individual basis. We can't make one size fits all decisions here. It has to be on that individual circumstances. Somebody that has maybe got underlying health conditions or different circumstances at home, that can't just be put into a box. You need to know your people, and that's the way I'm getting good stuff.
Yeah, Annie, that's a key one to bring you back in terms of how people are tackling that safety aspect and communicating it to their employees, given that they've now got an option to stay at home and work or come into the office. What good or bad practices have you seen out there?
Well, in practice, we're not really seeing it yet, but the anticipated fears, this is from an employer perspective, are that there will be some shirkers amongst all of this. And, you know, my own view on that is that the more preparation companies do, the less wiggle room there is, you know, for anyone to say, I don't feel safe, you know, I don't feel confident, or whatever that might be. So being ready, and you know, we're talking about the tech end right now, and being able to show your employees, it might be a video fly through, it might be, you know, conversations, on a group that demonstrates through stills, you know, what's been happening. All of those really count in reassuring everybody in an effort to, you know, to bring them back together. It's I know we're going to sound like parrots, but it all comes back to those conversations and the communications in what happens. But the solid stuff has to be there, that I know that the gents are going to talk about very shortly.
And it's a nice opportunity to bring Sam in. So, Sam, let's assume we've tackled the communication part. We sent them a lovely video on how the workplace is changing. We might have even embraced technology. Could you give us a feel as to what you see in organisations tackling technology to decongest the workplace and the reception area, particularly, because I know that's your field?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of knee-jerk reactions at the moment within the marketplace. You know, there's a lot of unknown at the moment. You know, there's very few companies that have employees back within the workplace, but we're seeing too much of knee-jerk, barrier tape, plexiglass over receptionists, masks, and we're seeing a significant uptake in thermal imaging cameras. But thermal imaging cameras typically being placed on a tripod where no thought's been given as to what they do if a reading is high, for example. So no thought that, do you prevent visitors or employees from actually, you know, being able to gain access to areas? Do you prevent them from checking in? What do you do when that temperature is high? Do you expect your staff to go, you know, and approach the person and putting themselves potentially in harm's way? Do they maintain a distance but then have to elevate their voice in order to maintain that distance, which of course can cause further anxiety to both employees and visitors as well? So a lot of just reactions rather than being proactive and looking at solutions that will continue to provide benefits after COVID as well.
So given you're at the sharp end and a lot of knee-jerk reactions at the moment, what would you recommend for people on this webinar in terms of the things that they should use technology for to de-risk the reception area, contamination, increase staff safety? What would you offer as advice?
I would certainly recommend that they use a solution that enables them to pre-register everybody. So we're all visitors now. So it's not just a case of, you know, people who don't work within the organisation. It's your employees, visitors. We're all visitors. Automate this process as best possible with the technology, and there are technologies out there that enable to do that. It will enable your frontline staff to be out of harm's way. It will enable the employees and the visitors to get through quickly without causing unnecessary bottlenecks. And it will put all of the necessary preventative measures in place so that in the event somebody has got a high temperature, you're acting upon that, and you're acting upon that sensibly rather than, you know, wondering what to do in the situation when that happens effectively. And that is really important. There's a lot of noise out there on thermal imaging cameras and which ones work, which ones don't, but there's not enough thought, being given as to what you do with that information, and that's really important.
Okay, so A, pre-register, B, make sure your transition times through reception are quick, and secondly or thirdly, have some workflow and processes in there for different aspects and different outcomes, particularly when you're detecting things like raised temperatures, etc. Could you just touch on different detection methods if people want to embrace that, in terms of how people are actually properly tackling that whole temperature reading thing, and how not to do it?
Yeah, well, so we're seeing three categories there. We're seeing the typical infrared, which seems to be the most cost-effective way of doing it, and we're typically seeing that technology within sort of small tablet forms. You've then got the body temperature solutions, where the approach there is to really record a moving target, so a cluster of people essentially and what their heat. And then you've got the more accurate ones, which is effectively looking more at the skin temperature. And what it does, it looks at the tear duct area of the eye, which is the most accurate way of detecting elevated skin temperature. The thing that people need to be mindful of here is that none of those solutions are 100%. But there are some, like the ones that are looking at the elevated skin temperature, that are more accurate because they're looking at a different part of the body. The typical body heat temperature solutions, the risk with those is that there could be multiple reasons why somebody has got an elevated body temperature. That could be because they've, because of exercise. It could be, obviously rushing to get to the offices. It could be because there's some kind of hormonal change in that person. There could be various reasons for that. So it's important that the organizations get it right and look at what they're trying to achieve here as well, and then what they do with that information, and also where they go afterwards as well. So in the event that, are you just asking the visitor to go or employee to leave, or are you taking them into another room, and where you go with that as well?
And I'll bring Simon Cohen in later on that, but one of the questions I've asked, you touched on, it's not just for the employee, it's also, or for the visitor, it's also the employee that we need to tackle. So that's a lot more data that you need in terms of pre-registration. How do you actually get all that data without creating another person's job, pushing that data into a visitor management system? I mean, how exactly, what would you give as advice as to how people tackle get us near to 100% of the visitors and employees that are due to come into the office? Yeah.
The first key one is choose the solutions that integrate with other platforms. And that is really critical. So it means you're not delivering technology solutions that are in silo, ones that actually integrate seamlessly from one another. So you can look at the entire journey from the moment of the pre-registration to when they arrive, to then access to the building, to where they're going and where they're going to be, where they will reside whilst they're in the workplace as well. That's really important that they all tie together. So you've got that constant data stream, not only to be able to react in real time to that data for prevention, but also to be able to then take that data and then analyze that data beyond as well. Because at the moment, it is all, it's all speculative. None of us know, because none of us are in the workplace, and none of these systems are active, because everyone's still at home at the moment. But when they are, we need to have the data sets that we can then continually make those decisions based upon actual facts, and then refine that process and react to what that data is telling us as well. That's very important.
And Simon Cohen, I'd like to bring you in right now in terms of collecting that data and populating visitor management systems. Could you comment on where Condeco are in that space, or what you've seen in the marketplace, and the considerations and points that need to be looked at?
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam, I liked your choice of words on the fact that for both employees and for visitors, there needs to be an element of pre-registration, and not just an element of it. To avoid overcrowding, you must have that element of pre-registration to stop too many employees and too many visitors, or too many visitors coming into the building. On the visitor side of things, Sam, you're absolutely right. You need systems talking to each other. They can't sit in silos. That needs to be, Office 365 or your your email calendaring platform. That needs to be your room booking system tied in with a visitor management platform, which then needs to be tied in with the experience at reception for the visitors when they're arriving into the building, to have that, that automation and that sleek, fast experience that avoids either queues at the reception desk or congestion there. That should be an open space with people flowing through it. And the only way is to have these systems tied together, have the pre-registration in place. And so I know products like Indeco have focused quite hard on these integrations, ensuring that we can very, very easily pass that information through to a system like SAM, so that when somebody arrives in the building, the screen that they're talking to knows who they are and who they're here to see and where the room is, and can direct them straight to it without having to go and ask lots of questions or approach anyone at reception desk.
And that for me is critical. So just to sum that one up, so you're able to take visitor and host detail out of Office 365, popular application that exists in 80% of most workplaces today, pull that into something like a Indeco system, and then populate a visitor management system. So remove the silos that were previously there, so that you have everybody with an invite pre-registered, and can decongest the workplace in terms of the reception area. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, and I can tell you, because we've already done this work. It's a really great visitor experience. It's actually quite an enjoyable visitor experience, it's there's no need to compromise. I think between increased safety and diminished user and visitor experience. You can have both of those. We can minimize risk, increase safety, but still have a great user experience, a great visitor experience coming into the building.
Sam, I'd like to touch on that one. So in terms of visitor experience, particularly with COVID around, what are the things that you've changed or been asked to change in your product by customers in order to optimize that experience? Let's assume you're capturing 100% of the data, you've got 100% of the visitor coverage. What then is the key considerations that customers are asking you to look at?
The key one, first of all, was the fact that our product is a giant touchscreen. So we had to overcome that challenge. So we implemented voice commands. So you no longer have to touch it, you just talk to it. So you very much like the Alexa type approach. You tell vGreet what you want it to do. The key thing, and lots of people are doing this, of course, is the thermal imaging cameras as well. So we're not thermal imaging experts, and none of us are. So I think what was key for us is actually we chose a partner that actually specialized this and has been doing it for a long time. So we integrated leading thermal imaging technology that is FDA approved, that is ISO certified. But for us, it was the use of that technology and the process that we enable was really critical to us. So what we're doing as a business is that we're constantly keeping things going. It's all about driving out waste and streamlining processes through technology. And that hasn't changed because of COVID. So it just means we've got these extra layers now. So it's automated. So if everything's fine, nothing changes. You won't know any different. If you do have a high temperature, then we stop you from doing things. So we are reacting instantly. And that, again, is automated, not putting others at harm.
And Simone, I'd like to touch on, do you think companies are actually embracing this type of technology and using that as part of their communication to employees to make them feel safer and therefore get the business re-energized and back up to full productivity again? Or
yeah, absolutely.
They are?
I think, it's crucial to add as well that this is not just a COVID-19 solution. This is the future of the workplace. Sam was selling, feed pods way before COVID, and I think it's important to say that whatever we invest in now, we don't want the knee-jerk decisions. We want something that is there for the employee experience in the longer term. And whatever we're going to do right now, look at the Perspex screens kind of conversation. There were one customer that were going to spend £100,000 on Perspex screens. You compare that and you ask, why do you need Perspex screens? And it was to keep people apart in the office. You then look at a desk booking solution and it's a tenth of the price. And I think that's where, the Perspex screens are, not going to be floating around in the scene 6 months time on a David Attenborough documentary. And I think this kind of you know, yes, it's relevant now, but it's also relevant. It's going to be relevant in the future as well.
And do you think there are many companies that have understood the ability to de-risk the workplace, communicate that to the employees? I mean, if you took a poll of the customers you're seeing, how many are going down the improvise and plastic and tape, and how many are going down the technology route, both short and long term?
We actually did do some polls, ran some customer roundtables, and from them results, it was 80% were going to embrace technology for that return to the workplace. And from the 80%, there was talking about using it for that social distancing element. So people are out there, the customers are out there. You know, many customers, you know, we've had a bit of a, I guess, a knee-jerk decision sometimes because they've potentially read the government advice that's coming out, which is very, yes, get some perspex screens and hazard tape. And I think when we go in and have these wider conversations and talk through more the implications and the impact on that fear and the employee experience, they're then much more open to the technology aspects. It's just almost, you don't know what you don't know, so we're there to almost try and help that conversation.
So Simon, thanks Simone. Simon, touching on that, going back up to the workplace and the desk and the meeting room, how have people reacted to that whole 2-meter space rule, and how can Cadeco and similar solutions help?
Yeah, it's interesting and highly topical at the moment. You know, it's 2 meters. Should it be less? Should it be 1 meter? I think there's always going to be a very broad spectrum of opinion on where individuals are in terms of the risk and how big an issue this actually is. The important thing, though, is that well, 2 important things here. One, the government guidelines say 2 meters, so really we need to be sticking to that for now. And secondly, and I think it's already been touched on, you know, there are those that that are very, very anxious about returning to the workplace, and for very good reasons. And so policy needs to ensure that all types of users, all employees, are respected in those opinions. How is it being, you know, how is technology helping solve that? I mean, you know, social distancing in the workplace, in its simplest form, is just about blocking out spaces to ensure that, you know, there's no one sitting opposite you or next to you. But to do that, again, you have to have that pre-registration element so that somebody knows that there's a space that's available. Actually, also that the space is clean, and we can talk a bit more about that later. But the space is available and it's clean, and there'll be no one next to them, and there'll be no one opposite them, and they don't need to worry about, you know, wandering around the office trying to find a safe space to work and you know, bumping into too many people. And I think if that can be, if you can use technology to define those rules and to implement those rules and to communicate out to the employee that they can trust the rules that are being put in place and they can feel safe in the workplace, then they can get it right.
I think that's a crucial point. And for me, I've heard of, is it occupancy-based cleaning? Could you just touch on that point and how that can potentially pay for some of the investment in technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was quite interesting around sort of end of April, beginning of May, when customers first started wanting to talk about returning to office and the strategy and the technology involved. The main thing they wanted to talk about was overcrowding, but then when the conversation continued, it moved on to the costs of cleaning the space, and in particular a deep clean, a COVID clean, where somebody's been sitting for the best part of a day, requires a much deeper clean than a standard clean on a desk. This sounds like a minor thing, but for the cleaning contractor, whether it's done in-house or not, to know which spaces need that deep clean and which don't, it saves an awful lot of money in terms of manpower. Literally the difference between, you know, maybe, you know, £1 or £2 a desk and £5 a desk, and in some cases, some of the organisations that we've spoken to, by understanding which desks have been booked and used, and being notified of which desks have been booked and used, and the fact that they don't have to deep clean all of the desks because they don't know, the saving alone on the catering has paid for all of the technology that's been required for them to return to office. So it's been quite interesting in understanding customers and some of the more indirect costs that we didn't expect to see.
Right. And I'd like to touch on, clearly that tackles the workplace being safe. If I'm an employee and I can see I've got a system that enables me to book a desk that's spaced nicely, it's going to be clean later. That's one thing, ticks my safety box. But for me, the frustrating thing was always who's in the office? How do I know if the person I want to work with is in the office without spending, tracking them down on Teams or countless emails or phone calls or texts or WhatsApps? Does Condeca help in that way, shape or form?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've always had functionality in our technology that allows someone to go to a mobile app or a kiosk or a website and say, where's Simon sitting today? He's in this building. He's on this floor. There's a far greater demand for this now. We know that even when we get back to the office and return to some normality, that working from home is going to be more normal, more standard, more prevalent. So all the more reason when we want to work with colleagues and understand where they are, to be able to go onto a mobile app and say, where's Simon today, and to be told he's working from home or he's in the office, he's on the 8th floor sitting at the sales desks. That information is crucial to support collaboration and getting back to working together.
And last point before we go into the Q&A, in terms of contactless management of the desk and the meeting room, how have you made strides in that? Because in the past you've had panels and discs to book and check in. How does that now work?
Yeah, again, we thought very hard about this. A large part of our business is hardware and screens that go on rooms and on desks. They're very popular. But at the moment, it's another element to interact with. It's another element to clean, and customers aren't really wanting to increase the cleaning that they have to do if they, where possible. And they asked us to look for other ways of doing some of those core functionality of those screens. The main one is the check-in. Can we check into a desk to say that we're there without having to touch a screen? And so our very clever guys in our development team in India managed to add into our mobile app the ability to check into a desk using the GPS location of the mobile app of the user. Effectively, when you're near the building, it automatically checks you into that space because it knows you've arrived at the office. And actually, as it does that, it adds a work order for the cleaning team, so they know that desk has been checked into and that they have to clean that space as well. And some other things that we built in as well around not having to, for our room screens, not having to touch the screen quite as much, minimizing the interaction there. So yeah, we've worked hard to try and make things as seamless as possible. Most new customers that are coming on board, we can deploy the whole thing without setting foot in the office because it's just all cloud software.
Excellent. So over to the Q&A session now. I remind all people listening to submit their questions. We will not get to them all in 15 minutes because I've seen the stack building up. But let's just look at a few of the questions here. So I think we've tackled how to decongest, how do we deal with core temperatures. Workplace density, Simon. There's a question here in terms of how do desking solutions enforce that 2-meter zone, and how easy is that to maintain?
So there's two elements to that. The first one is being very clear on your floor plan and in the desk booking system which desks are out of service or out of action, and which desks are available. So you've got the spacing enabled to ensure that people aren't sitting too closely to each other. And then the other element is policy. It's quite simply, if you haven't booked a desk, then you don't come into the office. And it's really the only way to manage overcrowding. Otherwise, you're going to hit peaks that are going to be problematic. And as we talked about earlier, it's going to be the reception area. It's going to be overcrowding as people are standing there wondering where they can work. They're going to be mixed in with visitors as well who are potentially coming in as well. The only way is pre-registration, as we said earlier. We have to know who's coming in and then draw a line when we have enough.
Okay, good one. And next question, Simone. Very good question, this one. Now the systems are joined up, how can we interrogate the data to comply with government track and trace for both visitors and employees?
You know, if you have to interpret data to do that, then your dashboard is not doing what you need to do ultimately. So the dashboard that we have would say, you know, last week the WHO declaration was, you know, the average occupancy of a workplace should be no more than 30%. You can then track back from the weeks what the actual occupancy was. When the WHO declaration kind of changed, or you could even go with local government information as well. And it will alert you as well as what floor was overoccupied. You can then also capture things like if you didn't want more than 5 visitors in your building each day, then, you know, through the system, you can obviously track how many visitors have been into your building and who they were. And, you know, ultimately bringing in that, why are people in the building? Can this conversation happen using the technology? Do they have to visit the workplace in the first place? You can start capturing that during this phase, I guess, where, you know, people are not going to want a lot of people coming into their workplace, because it takes it from almost a controlled environment to then something a little bit more on edge, if you've not got the right technology in place.
So I've had a couple of conversations that I've certainly seen where the whole facilities guy suddenly finding himself up in front of the HR director and the head of legal going, how's your track and trace work? What we're saying in, you can aggregate both the visitor data and the workplace desk and room data and cover that facilities guy's concerns, so that the HR director and legal guy can be told, yep, we know exactly who Fred sat next to on this date. Is that correct?
Yeah, because, you know, we know that when you start relying on people filling in, you know, Excel spreadsheets, you could almost compare it to people that do stock checks on spreadsheets of, they just don't work. You need the technology there. And I think if you've not got the sound data, then it is just an opinion. And, you know, if there's an outbreak in your workplace of, you know, even one person catching something would be a disaster. If there's a bit of an outbreak, you do not want to be sat in front of the health and safety executive with a spreadsheet thinking, oh, I think this is who was in the workplace on that day. I think we had this many visitors in. It's not going to cut it. And I think, you know, to protect the business, you know, we talk what's the cost of the technologies, and I think, you know, we need to focus on what's the cost of not doing it. You know, your people, health and safety is absolutely, you know, what you need to focus on right now. And
the other side, Annie, if I could bring you in, what are the other costs that companies should be looking at in terms of reputation, etc., of not getting this right?
Yeah, there's 2 things. One is that recognized responsibility, both for the employer and the employee. And, you know, what is that responsibility? Well, it's about taking accountability for one's lifestyle decisions and where you're going to be and what you're going to be doing and what you might bring into the workplace. And from an employer perspective, you know, we've talked about all of that for sure. And Simone touched on this earlier, and it's the brand asset value. It's you know, the negative impact risks are higher for all the things that don't happen. And I think, you know, in the not too distant future, any employees moving around are absolutely going to want to know what your policy is for keeping them safe. And we talked about the sensitivities of tracking too. That protection has to go hand in hand with very sensitive tracking. You know, in terms of how that is held. But, you know, for me, you know, clean living is the new cocaine. Clean living and working is the new cocaine, because the knock-on effect of making a poor decision and perhaps making yourself vulnerable and then going into the workspace will not be gladly received from your colleagues. So personal responsibility for absolutely everybody, and brand asset value if you do not do these basic things we're talking about that involve technology, conversations, and general care.
Thank you very much. Right, Sam, there's a question for you coming here. Return on investment. Somebody's obviously checked your pricing. What return on investment criteria can I apply to visitor management technology? And is that the only measure?
Yeah.
Broadly the question.
Yeah, it's not the only measure, and there are lots of factors, but this, I mean, as a starting point, then yes, in terms of visitor management, and this is before COVID, and it is more relevant now that that COVID has happened. So effectively, by having the right tools and creating the right efficiencies, you're taking a lot of fat out of the model. Now, there are situations with obviously doing that there's less need for people in those situations. Typically, the type of return on investments that we achieve with our products is primarily on receptionists, whether they're being redirected for another role that can still take that sort of secondary role as a receptionist, because they can communicate differently via video, via the technology to the visitors. There isn't a fixed ratio effectively, but we have typical examples of customers where on just literally a handful of these endpoints, they're saving in excess of £170,000 a year. But the key driver being efficient, not just the efficiencies, but in terms of cost savings, but the efficiencies in terms in actually getting people in and out, giving them more information, and actually creating a better experience because of not having increased waiting times. And that is only going to become more prevalent now, and those waiting times are going to increase. So it's very important. It's not just reception. There's also, there's other touch points as well, such as security. And then there's the realization of the return on investment. And if you don't do these things, so again, pre-COVID, we saw some organizations, some large global organizations actually take a stance where they removed all front of house teams. Now, the first thoughts are it's quite hard to show a return on investment if you've already cut that resource. But really, when we looked at it in more depth, was the return on investment here is that you're actually having to get your employees to go and filling that role and take it in turns to become a receptionist. Now, I can guarantee those employees are probably going to be higher paid than those receptionists. Not to mention, what's the cost to you as a business if your important customers are coming in and their first impression is not great because they're having to wait around for prolonged periods and they don't know where they're going, who they're seeing, they can't get hold of anyone. So there's lots of other factors, not just the obvious.
Okay. Right, next question. This is a cracker. In terms of it's a statement at first. It says, we clearly weren't ready for COVID, and technology can help us with COVID. Has it got longer term benefits or is it short term only? Question for you, Simone, and then I'd like Simon to cover after.
Yeah, it's got long-term benefits. We clearly weren't prepared, and I think we need to take this as a learning lesson. Look at what's worked, what's not worked throughout all of this. We've got a really good opportunity here to reset how we were working, and move it into the future. So what kind of future do you want for your business and your workforce? And ultimately, you use this opportunity as going, this is what can be used in the future. This is a very knee-jerk, fix. And it's about getting a balance. There may be some quick knee-jerk solutions that get a certain amount of people operational immediately. I think before you throw lots of money at it, look into the future and try and predict a little bit more, because if the data's right, we're going to have a second wave. So what can we do now to help that in the future? And this might not be the only pandemic that we have. We don't know what the world's going to look like in the future, so we need to build our resilience.
Simon?
Yeah, I think Simone sort of made the 2 points that I was going to say quite well. Number one being this isn't going to, this is going to change the way that we're working. There'd been a trend over the last 10 years to, flexible working, remote working, office space used in a different way that the last 3-4 months has only accelerated. And so I think it's probably important that the technologies that is invested in today helps an organization to support remote flexible working with the right technology to enable that. Make allowances for flexibility in the short to medium term as they want to, perhaps increase and decrease density of the space. Again, technology helps to do that. And then again, as Simone said, there could be a second wave, and this could probably will happen again. And I think that You know, we were all caught on the hop this time. Everyone has disaster recovery plans, but nobody planned for this. Well, now we are, and so we need to be ready if this happens again, to be able to implement those kind of plans. And actually, that probably means being ready with the technology, and you know, not sitting here and waiting, you know, 3 or 4 months for government guidelines to come in and technology companies to say, have you thought about this? I think organizations need to be ready for next time.
Thanks, Simon. And that leads me to conclude the webinar. Thank you very much to the panel. I thought that was an excellent set of robust answers to some fairly stiff questions from the audience. What we will be tackling, as I said to you at the beginning in the housekeeping section, is sessions on the solutions themselves. They will be steered by questions that you've answered in the next seminar. We will send to all of you a recording of this session. I hope you found it useful, and do remember to look at some of the integrations there to see how they apply to your business that are all different, and be safe out there. Thank you very much.